Good morning if you're in the UK, good afternoon if you're in Europe, and obviously good evening if you're further to the east. My name's Don Taylor, I'm chairman of the Learning Technologies Conference, and we're experimenting over the next couple of days with Google Hangouts brought to you through our partners DreamTech. The idea is we share some of the thoughts, some of the ideas that we pick up at the conference, and we're calling this the Google Hangout Room. We're calling it the Room of Reflection, a place where we can reflect on some of the things which we've picked up on. Of course, the conference has only just started, so I'm reflecting here with Martin Cousins about not what's happened at the conference, but other bigger thoughts that are happening in the world of learning and development and the bigger sphere. Martin, we're going to be talking about how the future of work is changing the future of learning. Martin, first off, before we jump in, can you just give everybody a quick background on who you are, and then we're going to talk about that topic. So Martin, who is Martin Cousins?
Thanks, Don. I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for many, many years. I've focused mainly in the HR space, and I currently run a small site called LearnPatch, which enables me to curate lots of different types of content, and that has kind of brought me around to looking at the future of work, because I think there's some really interesting stuff being written and some quite interesting shifts taking place. So. Yeah, that's what sees me.
All right, so nice segue. So we're in the future of work. It's a term that's bandied around a lot. A lot of people talk about it. Can you encapsulate in 2 minutes what does it mean and why is it important for people in learning and development?
I'll give a quick caveat. I'm no economist and I am no expert, right? Okay. But I do take an interest in this. I read probably unhealthy amounts of stuff around this kind of thing. So. That being the caveat, I would say that right now we've had 20 or 30 years of human resources making workplaces incredibly efficient through offshoring of skills, through contracts that now see us having 0 hours contracts. So we've got very good at making the human bit of the organisation as efficient as possible. But we've now got these bigger trends hitting in, which are around the on-demand workforce and the fact that a lot of task-based work can be brought in. So we can bring skills in. So we've got lots of emergent sort of business models around things like TaskRabbit, Odesk, Elance.
Everybody may not know what TaskRabbit is.
So these are basically technology platforms that enable people to provide their skills and connect those skills with people that require those skills. So I might right now say, I need someone to come and dry clean my clothes for tomorrow, and someone might just come around and say, I'll do that for £5 and come back and then deliver it.
And at Christmas time, the classic one is, I haven't got time to wrap my presents, and you get somebody in to wrap your presents for you. Yeah. How does that affect learning and development?
So there's kind of a roundabout way of saying that really there's this, I think that the nub of it right now is that there are lots of people on some quite strange and efficient contracts at the same time that organisations require employees are looking for meaning at work, right? So that's the context. And organisations require lots of skills that they just can't get hold of currently. So it's quite a complex and fast-shifting business environment, I think. And for learning and development, I think we've just seen Sugata Mitra talk about how learning needs to change. And he's talking about that in the context of how the world is changing, powered by technology. So I think we are looking at engaging people in very different ways who may not be sitting in an office.
And it's not just they're not sitting in an office. They may not work for the organisation full-time. They may not work for the organisation at all. They may not be physically in the office. They may not be physically in the country. They may have very little emotional attachment to the business. That's the world we're looking at. It's very different to the world of 20 years ago. You could rely on most of the people you train being on the payroll. So have you got any stats, any numbers? You've got a whole sheet of paper there in front of you. Any numbers that reflect that the reality of how things have changed?
Well, I think we have to firstly fess up to the fact that decades of spending on the people in the organisation just has, in the UK in particular, just hasn't worked. So, and I don't know how many billions of dollars or pounds are spent globally on things like leadership development, but in the UK, the productivity levels are over 2% lower than they were in 2008. Now that's at a time when organisations are probably investing heavily in things like skills, management, leadership, and output is well below the G7 competitor nations. So if we were to take that as a very bold measure, I think what we've got is a situation where stuff just hasn't worked, right? And I think...
So just to be clear, you're saying learning and development hasn't been doing its job because we are producing less than we were 7 years ago.
If you took productivity, UK's productivity as a measure, then, and it's going down, and it continues to go down and has done for years, it's just a question, really. It's like, well, what's the relationship between L&D and the fact that productivity is going down? I think that's quite an interesting line of inquiry. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that every L&D programme in the UK has failed, but I'm just asking the question, why, if we're putting all this money into developing people, productivity stubbornly stays going in that direction? And the other thing is, the CIPD did quite an interesting piece of research, which said that the quality of UK management has failed to improve in more than a decade. Now, I know, we know that this is an area of big investment for organisations. It's how are they going to get the next generation managers? How are they going to do that when people are on 0 hours contracts and they're not in the office? They're virtual managers. What does management look like in the future? I don't know. But the fact is, we've kind of not done a very good job over the last 20, 30 years. And there's quite a lot of research to suggest we haven't. So where that sits now, I'm not trying. I sound like the Grim Reaper or something, and I don't mean to come across like that. I'm trying to challenge us.
I think it is important to have these challenges because it's very easy in all professions affected by the internet today to imagine that somehow what's happening to us, oh look, people are using Google, oh look, the classroom doesn't seem to be working as the way it used to, is somehow unique to our position. It's not. What's happening is the nature of work is changing as a result of largely the introduction of the internet, which Andrew McAfee of MIT compares to the impact of the steam engine in the 19th century, that sort of utter transformation of the way people work and live. So I think you're not being the Grim Reaper, you're raising some important questions. Tell me about this business with 0 hours contracts. Can you explain what one is? And what effect does that have on L&D? Why is that important? Because I know that lots of people in the UK in particular are on 0 hours contracts. So why should that matter to us? Aren't they just people who can be trained?
Well, I think contractually you're just treating people in a way that you're treating them as units of
commodities.
Commodities. So contractually you're not giving them any benefits of working for an employer in the way that you once did. So all the benefits of holiday pay and all those kinds of things don't exist, and you are required. You're paid for the time that you do your job, and you can be required to come and do your job at very short notice, and you can be dispensed with quite quickly. So it's very much a sort of on demand. We need you today. Come and do this. It's only 2 hours. We won't need you for another 3 weeks. So that's what that represents. Now the challenge with that is those people still need the right skills to do the job. So what does that look like for L&D? Now I've heard that some organisations are kind of dealing with that by making learning and development a benefit to keep them kind of interested in working for them. So that might look quite different. It might be that the onus will shift to the employee to make sure they are trained up. So the employer is giving them the opportunity to put skills into practice, but maybe they have to pay for the training. And maybe that's the commitment that the individual has to bring, which that might be utter anathema to lots of people, because that paternalistic role of the employer as the one that provides the benefits, and in those benefits are always the development opportunities. Maybe they will still exist, but maybe employees will be paying in part for some of their own development, but the tie with the organisation will be that we will help put that into practice.
And it may be in the future that, therefore, all benefits, training and learning being one of them, come to the fore as things that are promoted as a way of trying to get hold of better people. Come to us and, no, we won't give you guaranteed employment, but we will help you develop yourself for your next job. And we've talked about Reid Hoffman's book, The Alliance.
Yeah.
Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn,
yeah.
and his idea that in the future we'll go towards more open contracts between employers and employees. I've got a question from Colin in Australia. Colin, thank you for staying up for us. I don't know what time it is with you, but we appreciate it. Colin is asking, given the current skills crunch that we're experiencing, which is a fair point, it's not like we've got all the skills we want, and with the digitization of the economy, this will continue. How will this impact L&D, and how we currently develop the workforce? So what do we need to do differently? So Colin's talking about the skills crunch and digitization. What impact do you think that's going to have, therefore, on how we're developing our people, regardless of necessarily of zero-hour contracts?
I have no crystal ball here.
That's why I'm here.
And I can't shine it, and I can't tell you the answer. But what I can say is that it really matters that we understand how business is changing, and it really matters that we understand what type of skills are actually required. I mean, it sounds like a statement of the bleeding obvious, but for many, it would appear that there isn't that understanding. Yeah. So I think that, we've just described the changing landscape, and I think to get a grip on that is the starting point. So Sugata Mitra, he's talking about, by the way, Reid Hoffman, that book is really good. And if you look him up on SlideShare, you'll see a really good slide deck. So you don't have to spend hours reading the book. Go and look at the first 9 slides of his slide deck, because they tell a great story, and I thoroughly recommend that. It kind of speaks to what we're talking about right now. So Mitra was saying, what happens? He was describing the change when the petrol engine came along, and there used to be coachmen driving horses and carriages, right? But unfortunately, when the engine came along, the passengers started driving the car, so there was no need for the coachman, and that's quite interesting in the context of learning, because L&D has been the coachman, I think. And the reality is that people are driving their learning. So in terms of the change, where does L&D sit in terms of making sense of what's required in an organisation? And I can't help but think that's a facilitating role. That's about understanding how people learn. And I think that if you look at the on-demand economy now, most of the skills, the traditional skills of L&D, they can exist outside of your organisation, and you can bring them in whenever you need them. The point is, you need to be able to look at how people can collaborate and work together to solve the problems in their business, and I think that's a different way of thinking about what L&D is there to do. But the important thing is it's a different way of looking at it, and I think that I think it's mindset. I really do. I don't think it's crystal ball gazing or necessarily me or anyone reading thousands of words about how things are changing. I think it's about being open to the fact that things are changing and what things might look like now and in the future.
You talked about learning and development being zombies and walking towards their doom.
I'm going to get
Hate mail.
I am, aren't I? Thanks, Don. So
you have talked about it in the past, but to be provocative and to help people understand this isn't something which we can just chat about, and that is something which is it's pretty important. I stood on the stage here 5 years ago, and I said we stand at a crossroads, and we have a choice not between flourishing and extinction, but between flourishing and irrelevance, which I think is a far worse fate. And I think it's the same thing. I think if we carry on doing the same thing we've always done, we're going to end up being trapped in what I call the training ghetto, where all we do is compliance and onboarding, both of which are really important, but we don't do everything else which training or learning and development should do. I think it's the same thing, just with different words. So what evidence do you have about the whole zombification of L&D?
Well, for a start, it comes back to the thinking again, because a lot of L&D teams aren't doing compliance. It's the compliance team that does compliance.
Right.
It's the legal team that's responsible for compliance training. It's not the L&D team, and that's interesting.
Yeah.
So whose responsibility is this stuff anyway? When I talk about, and I am in danger of being disliked, to say the least, when we talk about zombie L&D stats, but okay, I take my reference point from the Towards Maturity benchmark, right? And the most recent one, now bearing in mind the impact that technology is having on how we access information, how we can talk to each other. So these content and communication basically are the pillars of learning, are they? Not? That's attention. So basically, how we access that it has completely changed with technology. So I'll give you a couple of zombie stats, right, which I think are alarming, to say the least. So 60% of L&D teams lack learning technology implementation skills. 54% lack knowledge of potential of learning technology. 17% of L&D teams know how to use social media effectively. That's 83% who don't. Now, it's 2015. Twitter is 8 years old.
Yeah.
That's alarming when we're talking about these sort of big shifts, these meta shifts, if you like, in how things are done, and we're not keeping up to speed. Now, what I do find fascinating, coming back to Sugata Mitra's talk, is that the one thing that hasn't changed in schools is the design of classrooms.
Yeah.
Although you get more round tables than rows facing forward, but essentially it's
you have somebody in front, and there's a power relationship.
Yeah, that's right. Now, the default learning method, if you like, in organisations for many is still the classroom, and it's regarded as the highest quality type of learning intervention. But interestingly, that's probably not going to get you to where you need to get to currently.
Not if we're talking about the workforce we described at the beginning of this conversation, which is maybe not in your building, maybe in a different country, and almost certainly not employed by you full-time. You may have no ability to require those people to come into a room. Yeah, and I think also, but it's the pedagogy. Yeah. It's the idea that someone is going to be standing in front of a room and having that dynamic that has existed for hundreds of years in schools. How much longer can we keep having that dynamic? It's for a lot of the stuff that needs to be learned in the workplace. I just don't understand how that still exists in the way it does. And now I know it takes time to change, and I know that organisations especially bigger ones, can be inherently slow to change. But I will come back. I've got some other stats on my sheet of paper. Stat me up, and then I've got a question from Andrew Jacobs. Then we have to probably wrap up.
Well, the PwC do this CEO survey every year, and the 18th one has just come out. So their CEOs are very concerned, pretty much across the board, that they don't have the skills they need, and that's going to challenge growth. Yeah. And 75% of British business believe that there's going to be a skills crisis in the next 3 years. So it comes back to the point Con was talking about. So there are these skills that we need, but where are they coming from? Yeah. And how are we upskilling the workforce, and how are we bringing them in from outside? I mean, this seems to be like a big challenge right now for many organisations, and the growth is going to come in being agile and creative. That's the point. And that's why we see big organisations losing chunks of their business to technology startups that are coming in and sort of...
Who are more agile.
Yeah, they're just reinventing the model. And that's where businesses need to be playing and being successful.
Let me ask you this question from Andrew Jacobs, and then I'm going to ask you to wrap up with telling us, given this new working landscape we're in, what the attitude shift that we need to have in L&D is. But I'll ask that in a second. We've got this question from Andrew Jacobs. He says, "You're right, Martin, we're developing a zombie culture. How do we prevent people from being infected in the first place?"
Well, I think it's our responsibility to model what we would like to see in other people.
Right.
I think it starts with the individual ways. And if you are the one to be seen to be understanding how things are shifting, asking some good questions of the business and bringing in the thinking that we're describing here today, and challenging how things are done, I think it has to start with the individual. Because if you're not modelling that yourself, then if you're in a team, how can you begin to expect other people to connect with that way of being?
Now, if that comes to the attitude shift, then does that mean that we have to have a different attitude, a different approach in the learning and development teams that is almost 180 degrees away from the fulfillment function that we were in the past? Is that what you're meaning by an attitude shift?
I think so, but I don't think this is just an L&D thing.
Right.
I think it's just a far more useful way of thinking for business to be, is it Carol Dweck that talks about growth mindsets and fixed mindset? I think it's quite easy. I'm in my early 40s, and it'd be quite easy for me to say that, I see the world in this way and I see it changing in this way based on everything I've experienced. But of course, everything I experienced involved years without a mobile phone, years without computers. So actually, am I really right in my thinking? If I'm fixed with my legacy, it's got to be an understanding of where we're going,
rather than where we've been.
Yeah, I think, and in our professional lives, we have a responsibility to understand that.
It strikes me we're talking about an environment in which we are requiring much more change, much more agility, much more thinking, keeping up to date with things from the learning and development team than we've had in the past. Last question coming in. Questions keep coming in. I've got one from Sharon very quickly because we need to wrap up in a bit. Sharon saying, and this is an interesting one, do you think productivity is decreasing because the learning in many organizations is now being led by business people rather than L&D people, and they're being less effective in leading the L&D teams?
That's a great question. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure how effective L&D teams are, would be my kickback on that in the first place.
Whoever is in charge.
Yeah, are we in a position to say the CEO knows more or less about how this organisation could be more effective than someone in L&D? I think we, as a profession, need to be less defensive about stuff, especially the fact that other people might know more about our job than we do. Can we get comfortable with that idea and then work with it?
But ditto, we should also be more proactive in saying, actually, we may know more about your job than you think you do, in the sense that we know how people can work effectively, whereas people concerned totally with the knowledge and the subject matter often don't see that side of it.
But I think it's the most exciting job or area to work in any organisation, because having the understanding of how things are changing and having the ability to influence people so that they enjoy their work more, they have a sense of developing themselves and know where this is going, and leading to organisational success, what couldn't be better than that? And that's what L&D is, I think.
That's a great point to leave it on, but we're not going to, because I have another question come in. But a pity, because that was a great final point. Is it not the case, asks Simon, that people interact with their technology for their own personal use? That's been wholly out of kilter with how they interact with technology professionally, and what's our role in L&D in all that?
I think it's real. I mean, this is the shifting sands of technology, and where work and play are blurring? I think it's a great question, and the change is being forced by consumer behaviour around technology.
Yep.
So Microsoft does a really good, started to do an annual survey of our attitudes towards personal technology. And, I think a big issue currently is privacy and how that plays out across our own devices in our personal world and what that looks like in a corporate world. That's quite interesting. But I think I think it becomes blurred. I think if you're going to become one of those people that is working outside of the organisation, not physically, and maybe you have other jobs.
Yep. Which is increasingly what's happening.
Actually, I mean, that's what I do. So I'm using open source tools to have different profiles in different places. It is all very blurry right now. I think it's a challenge for organisations how they. Where you draw the line, but then I think that's the line of inquiry.
But L&D, would you say that part of L&D's role has to be not to try to create and control, but rather to facilitate and mediate?
Yes, because you don't know where and when this learning happens.
Yeah, you don't.
And I think the technology needs to enable that, across our working and play time. And it's a negotiation for us now around the fact that it's happening outside of work. So what does that mean for inside work? Can we have a sensible conversation about the fact that I saw something there, I read that for an hour, actually I'm going to take an hour off my day because I've done that there. Can we not have that kind of mature conversation?
And it comes back to how the relationship between people, their managers and their workplace is changing. Back to the future of work. We may not have answered all the questions about the future of work, but at least we posed some good ones. And we've had some great questions from you guys out there. Thanks very much. This is the first part of our experiment. We're running 6 Google Hangouts during the course of Learning Technologies. Thank you very much for joining us. Martin, thanks very much for having a great sparring contest here on this one. Next up, we've got Nigel Payne with Kate Graham talking about the challenge of learning, and then our third and final session today will be Sharon Claffey-Kelly will be talking with Fons Trompenaars, talking about some of the concerns about working across cultures and across countries. So if you want further information about that, just check out Twitter. More information about that coming down the Twitter stream. In the meantime, thanks very much for being here. Martin, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.